Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening. Great to have your company as always. It's the last sitting week ahead of the May budget. It kicked off today. We'll bring you all the happenings from Canberra, as well as the headlines making news across the country. Here's what's coming up on Credlin. Concern yet again that more rights might be stripped away from faith-based schools. There's been a powerful intervention today from the Archbishop of Sydney calling for reforms as a betrayal of faith. I'll speak with Anthony Fisher a little later in the show, although I must say it seems that some religions in this country are now more equal in Labor's eyes than others. Has Chris Bowen finally read the writing on the wall that his new emissions standards are simply unrealistic? With reports the minister faces a humiliating backdown on his ute tax. I'd like to believe common sense has prevailed, but this is Chris Bowen, so who knows? Plus, we'll cross live to London for the latest on Princess Catherine after the shock cancer announcement over the weekend, as the huge backlash against social media misinformation and manipulation continues. And more bad news for the Albanese government, with the latest Newspoll showing Labor is drifting towards minority government as broken promises and cost of living take their toll, a point that was not missed today in the Parliament.
The Prime Minister promised on 100 occasions to the Australian people before the election that he would cut power prices by $275. He's never mentioned that figure since. At the moment, 500 families a week are going on to energy hardship arrangements because they can't pay their bills, a nearly 60% increase on Labor's watch. Will the Prime Minister apologise to these struggling families?
But first, it's pretty clear that the rule of law, as we've long understood it, is coming under serious challenge. We believe as Australians in protecting religious freedom, but these days some religions have more protection than others. Just as we still believe that people are innocent until proven guilty, only that these days some crimes require less proof than others. This morning, the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney, writing for the Australian newspaper, declared that religious freedom, as it's traditionally been understood, the freedom, he said, to gather, speak freely, pray together and undertake works of service, is being reduced slice by slice. He cited the Green Left ACT government's recent expropriation of Canberra's Calvary Hospital. Reportedly, he claims, because it would not perform elective abortions. Well, nor does the government-run Canberra Hospital either, but it hasn't been shut down. That was for operational rather than ethical reasons, we're told. Throw in the hounding of the Archbishop of Hobart over his defence of sacramental marriage, the saga involving Israel Folau, and the attacks on former NAB bank boss Andrew Thorburn, forced out from an AFL club presidency because he was also the president of a local church where a decade earlier an anti-gay sermon had been preached. And it's not hard to feel as though Christianity is under siege. Now, you may not agree with all of those positions, but they are positions that Christian churches have had for a millennia. And now it's the schools in the firing line, with the recommendation from the Australian Law Reform Commission that religious schools lose the exemption they've long had under anti-discrimination laws that allow them to employ staff and educate young people in ways that uphold the religious ethos of the school. Other than those specifically involved in the actual teaching of religion, religious schools, the Law Reform Commission recommends, if it gets up, will no longer be able to insist that staff and students live by the religious ethos of the school. In particular, religious schools won't be able to use sexual orientation, gender identity or relationship status to say that students or staff at a particular school, you can't say to them, sorry, this mightn't be the right school for you. Now, if religious schools were routinely sacking gay teachers or expelling students who've got doubts about their sexuality or their gender, rather than suggesting that anti-religious activists are best to go elsewhere, the Law Reform Commission might have a point. But because schools have invariably adopted a pastoral approach, this recommendation, that's strongly supported, I might add, inside the Albanese government, is essentially an attack on the right of religious schools to promote their faith, and yet another move in the Marxist left's campaign to undermine our country's Judeo-Christian ethic. But while the human rights establishment is hyper-vigilant against any infringement of some minority rights, other minorities, it seems, can be attacked with impunity. Notoriously, police across the country have had no trouble crushing freedom protests with tear gas and rubber bullets in the past, but they've been extraordinarily passive in the face of rampant anti-Semitism and support for genocide. Not before time, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry has just formally lodged racial vilification complaints in the Australian Human Rights Commission against two radical Islamist preachers who've been urging death to the Jews. Now, shortly I'll speak to the head of Australian Jewry, but this is some of what they are objecting to from Imam Ahmed Zaud from a Sydney sermon last December.
أهم صفة من صفات اليهود هي أنهم شعب متعطش لسفك الدماء، شعب يحب سفك الدم، فهم يربون أولادهم منذ الصغر وينشئونهم على الإرهاب، على العنف، على القتل. كان هؤلاء الجبناء يتساقطون أمام ضربات المجاهدين ويفيقون منهم كالجرذان.
And here's the other one, Abu al-Sayed, also known as Brother Ishmael.
These worshippers of Iblis, yes, the descendants of pigs and monkeys, are stealing the organs of your brothers and sisters. It wasn't bad enough that they killed them, they also want to take their organs. They took their houses, they took their lands, and now they want their organs.
And these are far from isolated instances. These are only two of the examples of anti-Jewish race hate. Now let's see where these complaints go. But if the human rights apparatus that thinks that Christian schools have no right to protect themselves from activists determined to mock and undermine religious teaching, if that apparatus turns out to excuse this sort of bile as just hyperbolic faith statements of Islam, it would be guilty of the most appalling double standards. We've come so far, so fast from the days when the Judeo-Christian faith in this country, with its treat others as you would have them treat you ethic, was accorded at least a modicum of respect. To the extent that Australia has an official religion these days, it's Indigenous ancestor worship, which we acknowledge at almost every civic gathering. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a place for that at an Indigenous event, not just at every event, when we land a plane and every sporting match. There should be a respected place for our Judeo-Christian heritage on which Australia has been built. A little later in the show, as I said, I'm pleased that the Archbishop of Sydney, Anthony Fisher, will join me. Look, also today on the vexed topic of gender, a welcome outbreak of common sense. This time from Dr. Andrew Amos, a James Cook University academic, writing in the Journal of the Royal Australian College of Psychiatrists. Now, as I've often said, in no other branch of medicine is a patient's self-diagnosis treated as conclusive basis for treatment, let alone the self-diagnosis of a child, some so young they can barely read or write. Or, as Dr. Amos says, gender-affirming care models that, quote, abandon the clinical discipline of diagnosis and make treatment contingent upon the unconstrained, subjective experiences of children and potentially disturbed adults. He says that gender-affirming care is, quote, fundamentally incompatible with competent, ethical medical practice, because he says it's, quote, unable to exclude the possibility that it is reinforcing the pathologies of some, most or all of its patients. It's not only unethical, but dangerous. That's right, the word dangerous. Yet still no minister and no government has got the courage in this country to even call an inquiry into gender practices that are pushed in Australia the very same practices that are now banned in many other comparable countries like the United Kingdom. Now, if these gender activists are so sure they're right, that they are acting in the best interests of children, then let them defend their procedures against the likes of expert psychiatrist Andrew Amos. The very fact that these inquiries get shouted down and shut down by Labor and activists right around the country, it's happened in Canberra and Melbourne and now Adelaide, says everything. As I said, Parliament's back last week before the May break. Let's go let's go there now for the headlines. Trudy McIntosh.
Australia's lowest paid workers could be in line for another wage boost backed by the Albanese government.
For the third year in a row, Labor will argue the minimum wage should keep up with inflation without naming a dollar figure. Last year, workers were awarded an 8.6% rise. It's not expected to be that high this year, with inflation dropping down to 3.4% in the year to January.
We know that cost of living pressures disproportionately impact people on the lowest incomes. That's why we are enthusiastic backers of the low paid in our country.
Business groups say the number needs to be much lower than inflation.
Inflation is coming off and productivity has been incredibly weak. If you put all of those things together, we will be making a submission, I think, of an increase of not more than 2%.
The wage boost will kick in from July 1, the same time as the revamped Stage 3 tax cuts. But in its submission, the government argues the wages increase should not be moderated by tax relief.
Another round of energy bill relief could be on the cards in the upcoming May budget.
More than 500 households a week have fallen into electricity hardship since the 2022 election. The Treasurer has flagged more help could be on the way for Australians struggling to pay the bills.
Well, that's under consideration. We've made it clear that there are a range of options available to the government, whether it's another round of electricity bill relief or other ways that we could help ease some of these cost of living pressures.
Prime Minister promised on 100 occasions to the Australian people before the election that he would cut power prices by $275. Will the Prime Minister apologise to these struggling families?
He was a part of a government that had 22 policies but didn't land one.
Support slides for Labor again in the latest Newspoll, raising the prospects of a minority government after the next election.
Labor's primary vote dropped to just 32%, now lower than where it was at the last election. The coalition support up to 37%. The two-party preferred also narrowed, Labor's lead 51 to 49. Meanwhile, minority government the reality for Tasmania. The Liberals under Jeremy Rockcliffe expected to fall short by 3 seats. They won't get Green support, so it's Jackie Lambie network or bust.
What I want to see first and foremost is them putting Tasmania first.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
As always, on a Monday, for his take, National Editor for The Australian, Dennis Shanahan. A very defensive government, I thought, today in Question Time, Dennis, on the issue of energy. Now, I'll get to that in a moment, but Newspoll shows, I think, why they're so defensive. That slide to a 32% primary, the lowest primary, even lower than the last election, certainly the worst result for the government since the Voice referendum and all the backlash we saw last November. I think you said this at the time, I certainly did. Things like that broken promise on tax, they don't always show up straight away in polling, but when you add in this whole continuing mess around the foreign detainees and there's anger in the community now, palpable anger about record high migration. These are areas where Labor already has an Achilles heel with voters. Throw in cost of living. We saw stuff the other day about an increase in broadly power prices. None of that's abating. This is why I think they're hurting, isn't it?
Well, it's always a mistake to read a poll, a change in a poll, as something that has happened, affected it in the last couple of weeks. Polls have a very slow effect, and we had, before this poll, a bit of an improvement for Labor, and you would hope so, or certainly Labor would hope so, after tax cuts of $104 billion directed to lower and middle income earners. So this was, supposed to be helping Labor, but what we've seen is that there's a little bit of a rise and now a little bit of a dip, and we're actually looking at the suggestion we're going back into a decline, or at least another levelling off at a very low level for Labor. So there is no doubt that this will be bad news for Labor. They are keeping at a level which it will not get them to be re-elected in their own right. I made the point today in The Australian that no government, no first-term government since World War II, and that includes Robert Menzies, Bob Hawke and John Howard, has actually improved the number of seats it had at its first election. They all have gone backwards, and they all had bigger margins than Anthony Albanese. Unless he can buck the trend of history and perform much better than John Howard, Bob Hawke and Robert Menzies, he is headed for minority government at least.
That is staggering. That is staggering. It's interesting today, you know, I mentioned they were very defensive on the issue of energy. So the coalition's got nuclear on the table. It says it's going to announce potential sites. It's certainly not a small target strategy if they go down that path. Yet today the government spent almost all of their airtime trying to rubbish and talk down the coalition's push for cheaper power. Have a listen.
The poster child for large nuclear reactors is Hinkley C in the United Kingdom, which has just come in at $86 billion Australian. $86 billion. That's their genius policy to put downward pressure on prices. $86 billion a pop for one reactor, and they want 6. Let's bring on the debate.
So I think it's telling, Dennis, when the government's acting like the opposition, they're not talking up their own policy. It's never again mentioning that $275 promised cut to power bills. All it's doing, and he's a bad salesman as it is, but all he is doing, Chris Bowen there, is hyperventilating about his opponents.
Well, again, it's a difficulty for governments when they are talking about opposition policy. Even if they are attacking opposition policy, it means that they're not talking about their own positive policies. They're being negative and they're highlighting what the opposition policy is. And a couple of little points there from Question Time today. At one stage, Richard Marles nominated where Australia is going to build a nuclear reactor in Derby in England to power the submarine. As well, when the Prime Minister was saying, oh, there's not one over there on the coalition branches, the seats, who would actually volunteer to have a nuclear power station in their electorate, someone called out, I will, bring it on. So what we're seeing is that the government is playing on the coalition's, the opposition's territory, and over a long period of time, no matter how effective that argument is, there is going to be an erosion of the government position and a build of the opposition position.
You picked up the same point that I picked up too about that spruiking from Marles. They don't like nuclear, but they're basically building a nuclear power reactor in the UK with taxpayer funds that will come back here and be put inside our submarines. I'll come to that a bit later in the show. Talk to me about Tasmania, because I watched those numbers play out on Saturday night. Libs ahead, Labor close but no cigar. Rockcliffe now, the current Premier, is trying to negotiate with what could be a crazy crossbench. Let's not read too much into it because it's Hare Clark. It's not a system that translates to the mainland, but I listened to Jackie Lambie. She gets her supporter base from broadly the centre-right. She looked and sounded to me like Oakeshott and Windsor back in 2010, finding a way that she can hang on to say, I can't support the Liberals. She's using the stadium, of course. Where do you think this is going to go?
Oh, look, I think that the Tasmanian election is difficult to drew any sort of comparison with federal, so I wouldn't go too far with that. As far as Jackie Lambie is concerned, I think she has developed into a shrewd politician. She's talking up her price, like Brian Harradine, a famous Tasmanian independent who ensured that Tasmania got everything. She knows her political survival and the political survival of her party at a state level in Tasmania depends on looking after Tasmania. I wouldn't be surprised that she will get the best deal she can for Tasmania, for her party, and end up in a coalition with the Liberals. The other side of this, of course, federally, is Labor can take no heart from it. Again, like the federal primary poll in Newspoll, very low, too low to get into government. But at the same time, this also demonstrates for Peter Dutton the weakness of the state Liberal Party machines. Western Australia, Victoria, Tasmania. These are areas where the state Liberals are not performing well. They lost a by-election in South Australia on the weekend, and this is a weakness for Peter Dutton federally. Yes, there are problems there for Labor federally, but I think that Tasmania is a demonstration of a warning to both sides.
And I just want to underscore that point for viewers at home. I mean, parties need to be in government at a state level for the infrastructure to improve, to be it's as strong as it needs to be, to then boost your chances of getting government in Canberra. And of course, in so many of those states, Dennis, where the Libs have got in, like Victoria and South Australia, they've only lasted a term, then they've been turfed out. But Labor's been, in the case of Victoria, in for 4 or 5 terms. In the case of South Australia, I think it was 17 years before Stephen Marshall got elected and was out within a term. So this makes a real difference to Peter Dutton. Talk to me about the minimum wage. The Albanese government's putting in a submission to the Fair Work Commission. Fair enough. That's the right of government, I guess. But I feel for the employers, particularly small business at the moment. Fair Work awarded nearly a 9% increase not so long ago on minimum wage, and nearly 6% to people on awards. The first one's those on the minimum wage, second's on the awards. But, I mean, these are big increases already in the system, and we know that so many small to medium-sized businesses, particularly in construction and housing, we desperately need them to survive. Well, they're not surviving, they're going into liquidation.
Well, I think when Jim Chalmers started talking about the minimum wage submission from the federal government, and look, let's also not lose sight of the fact that people on the minimum wage is not actually a very large part of the working population. Certainly the awards are far more important. But even given that, Jim Chalmers was trying to say we are going to, as a government, argue for more money for people on a minimum wage. But he was also being careful because he knew if he pushed too hard, and he didn't give a figure, he only talked about inflation. We have another inflation figure coming. But he also knew that the ACTU submission was coming out, which has gone for a figure of more than 5%. So I think that Jim Chalmers, trying to keep inflation under control, trying to say to low-income workers, we're on your side, is caught between a rock and a hard place where he's got to try and say, we'll give you as much as we can, but we can't give you too much, and it may actually be less than what the ACTU is suggesting. So I think Chalmers on a high wire act here, trying to balance things, and there is no doubt wage rises are continuing to pressure business and continuing to put away the prospect of a mortgage rate relief.
And that's a worry too. Dennis Shanahan, thank you as always. All right, after the break, he wrote a powerful piece about the erosion of religious freedom on the weekend. Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. Today he wrote that. The Archbishop of Sydney will join me shortly. Plus, more on that referral to try and hold those hate preachers to account. Welcome back. Still to come, will Chris Bowen eat humble pie and actually back down on his vehicle emission standards as more and more countries wind back their ambitions? But first, religious groups are hitting back against the Australian Law Reform Commission's recommendations, which could see faith-based schools lose the right to hire teachers who share their beliefs. Last week, the Commission released a report recommending that Section 38 of the Sex Discrimination Act should be abolished. This is the section which contains exemptions, allowing religious schools to hire teachers on faith grounds. Today, the Sydney Catholic Archbishop has written a powerful piece for The Australian, warning these so-called reforms would undermine the freedom of parents and religious groups to provide faith-based education, and called on leaders to reject the report. I'm pleased to say Archbishop Anthony Fisher joins me now. Well, you wrote today in The Australian that religious freedom, Archbishop Fisher, in Australia is being reduced slice by slice. Do you feel that this decision by the Law Reform Commission is part of a larger and broader trend?
I think there is a bigger trend. I think we've seen a series of cases where an archbishop was dragged before a tribunal for teaching what his church teaches about marriage, where a guy lost his job as a leader of a bank because of the church he belonged to, a woman that lost her job because she said on the social media that for religious reasons she didn't support same-sex marriage. So it's happening out there in the workplace, in the community. We've had pressures from governments to implement some radical sexuality and gender programs in some states, on hospitals to provide abortions, even if they're church hospitals, or euthanasia. And now there's this trend in government reports. Now, the Law Reform Commission one is obviously hostile to faith schools, but it's not alone. We had one from the Productivity Commission recently, which was against people who make donations to school building funds, having tax deductibility. We had an ACT parliamentary report criticising Calvary Hospital for its religious ethos just before they then took over the hospital. So this is part of a broader trend. And I think if you look at these government reports, like the one now from the Law Reform Commission, they're often based on a very narrow range of advisors. There's very little transparency as to what they're thinking or where they're going. And then there's sweeping recommendations at the end. Unhelpful.
We know that parents don't support a lot of these reforms. I mean, a survey has just revealed that the majority of private school parents, they want religious schools to retain the rights they have to hire teachers who share their values. I mean, this is why parents often work a couple of jobs to be able to afford a non-government school education. Surely this is also about parental choice.
Absolutely it is. And I hope that government will listen to that, listen to the parents who are, after all, many of them, their electors. It's important also, I think, for the parents to speak out, not only in surveys, but to be talking to their GP, their MPs, to be letting them know they value having the option of a religious schooling. And we know parents are voting with their feet for church schools, that the enrolments are going up and up in the church schools. So it's clearly something they want. They want that choice. And I hope our leaders can hear that.
I get dismayed when I read and listen to how some of these faith-based schools are portrayed as cruel and callous. Put my hand up to say I went to Catholic schools, and I've seen gay students in Catholic schools supported in a pastoral way. I've seen transgender kids in Catholic schools supported in a really pastoral way. This is about, though, the school having the choice about what those parameters I assume might be, and the school being allowed, though, to still, within that pastoral care, teach its faith. If this got up, what would it practically do to faith-based schools and their autonomy?
Well, I think the biggest impact will be on our students. Now, I meet students in our Catholic schools where the school's made a huge difference to them. And it might not have been the religion class or the religion teacher. It might have been a maths teacher or a music teacher or someone in the office. But someone has inspired them in faith and morals. And if we're not able to choose the kinds of staff that do that, it's the kids that lose out in the end. And now, we've long dealt compassionately with staff and students of all sorts of situations, with good pastoral care, with individual attention to them, and we'll continue to do that. But we don't want to be distracted by endless lawfare from people that want to engage in some kind of activist program in our schools. We don't want to be afraid to have the sensitive conversations or to be always looking over our shoulder at the lawyers are coming or the tribunals are coming. We want to keep doing what we've done so well for more than 200 years now in Australia, and that's providing the best education we can within our spiritual tradition without fear of being interfered with.
Do you feel after that Calvary Hospital decision, it's a Catholic hospital for those outside of Canberra, after it was expropriated by the ACT government, do you feel that that example creates a precedent for some left-wing governments, add to this debate now about schools? Do you feel like there's this not so hidden agenda, particularly in relation to the Christian faith?
Look, it is worrying that any of our government, state or territory, could think they'd pick on a religious a church or a hospital or a school or an aged care facility and decide to close it, or in this case, expropriate it, make it a state hospital. And that is a very bad precedent. It's the kind of thing you expect to happen in North Korea or Cuba or somewhere, not in Australia today. And when a thing like that happens, you'd hope that governments, including, for instance, when that happened in the ACT, the Commonwealth government would stand up for the good that religion does in our community and stand up for believers. But the fact is, people of faith and their institutions make an enormous contribution to education and healthcare and welfare and aged care in this country, and that gets lost in these activist controversies. And when these government departments or radical governments decide that they're going to try and push believers out of service provision, we all lose out.
And just quickly, Archbishop, have you seen the draft legislation? I understand only the opposition's had a briefing. It's still being held back by the government. Have you had that consultation?
So no, I haven't seen it. I've had discussions with various political leaders on all sides, but we haven't seen the legislation yet.
Archbishop Fisher, thank you for your time. That's the Archbishop of Sydney there, Anthony Fisher. Let's stay, though, with the theme and return to those sickening sermons we heard delivered by several Muslim clerics in Sydney's southwest, where, amongst other things, Jews were described as monsters, rats, bloodthirsty and vile. I played a little of those two sermons at the top of the show, and a complaint has now been formally lodged against those two preachers with the Human Rights Commission by one of Australia's peak Jewish groups, and that organisation, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, has been forced into this position because of little or no action from authorities. Joining me now is their co-CEO, Alex Rivkin. Alex, thank you for your time. I'm sorry it's yet again on this terrible stain on our national consciousness, but what's put you in the position where you have to bring forward a complaint like this and the authorities have done so little to date?
Well, thank you, Peter. Since October 7, we've seen this rolling sequence of sermons on a weekly basis, really, each more horrific than the last, which are deliberately intended to incite hatred and violence against our community. And coming at a time of heightened tension in our society, this isn't merely individuals spouting their own views. These are religious clerics, authorities who are listened to, whose views are adhered to by their followers. It's an extremely dangerous phenomenon, and the laws in this country and in this state clearly are inadequate to deal with this. There has been no prosecution at all. And so we felt we had to take action to protect our society and to protect our community. Ultimately, we're the root body of the Jewish community. Our obligation is to protect Jewish life and Jewish way of life, and we felt this legal action was sorely needed.
I think what makes me saddest about what we've seen in some of those clerical speeches from the imams, Alex, is that they are online, so they're available, as we've seen in the past where there has been radicalisation of young people, that they're available to young people, that their parents may not even know that they're watching them. They'll certainly go around the world. That's a shocking message to come out of Australia.
It is, and I can tell you it's been noticed around the world. I mean, I was in New York recently to meet with the Jewish leaders of other major communities around the world, and they're all asking me what the hell is going on in Australia. This was always viewed as a beacon of multiculturalism, a cohesive society, a tolerant place where foreign conflicts and hatreds aren't imported, but that's clearly changed, and something needs to be done about this. We can't have a situation where these religious leaders are inciting their communities against their fellow Australians. That's not who we are. That's not what Australia is about.
Look, it does strike me as strange that we have that example. I was just talking there with Archbishop Fisher. You will know him from Sydney, the Catholic Archbishop, about the case of the Hobart Archbishop who was hauled before the Human Rights Commission down there because he was teaching the Catholic edict that marriage is between a man and a woman. And yet the same human rights apparatus in this country can let the imams spew their hate as they have been doing now for months. There's no great censure of them. You've been forced to take an action to put it on the table, to force them to look at it. But they've been criticised recently for not adequately addressing anti-Semitism. How confident are you they're going to take your complaints seriously?
Well, I think there's something broken in our society where you have people professing good faith views derived from their religion and suffering greatly for it, and others speak to their religious views in a way that incites hatred and violence towards other Australians, and they get away with it. There's a great state of impunity there. In terms of the Human Rights Commission's ability to deal with this, they've dealt with 18C complaints well in the past. There's a process of conciliation, and if there's no prospect of a satisfactory conciliation, which I think will be the case in this instance because the individuals we're dealing with, it's terminated and then the matter goes to the federal court. So one way or another, we're determined to get justice for our community. And as you said at the top of the segment, the things that these clerics have said are so egregious, so boldly offensive and horrific, and intended to incite violence and hatred against Australians on the basis of their race and ethnicity, that I think that any decision maker will find in our favour. I think it's a very clear-cut matter.
I hope you're right, Alex, and it is a great shame that you're forced to actually bring the action yourselves. Thank you very much for your time, Alex Ripken there. Let's go to a break. After the break, though, Labor's hypocrisy over nuclear power, plus the push to require permits to protest as more pro-Palestine events turn nasty. Welcome back. Shortly, we'll cross live to London for reaction to Princess Catherine's cancer announcement from the weekend. But first to the panel, LNP MP Keith Pitt, former Howard Government Minister Gary Hargrave. Well, gentlemen, welcome. Let's start with what we hope, Gary, is a bit of good news. It looks like we might see a humiliating back down from Chris Bowen. We've got the US, backing down from their vehicle emissions. It looks like this ute tax could be altered in some way. I hope it will be. We're expecting it this week. But do you think his back down will be big enough?
This bloke has got to find reverse gear on a lot of things, Peter, so that is a very leading question. But I mean, just the other week he was announcing all these new electric charging stations across the Nullarbor, and they're all powered by diesel fuel. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up.
You can't make it up.
I think on so many fronts, Chris Bowen will be front and centre of the epitaph written for the Albanese government. He is on a crusade to drive up the costs of living for everybody, and it's the fuel you put in your car is one thing. The price of electricity, well, it's doubled for many Queenslanders, for instance. We used to have such cheap electricity and so much of it, we had to invent new ways to use it. They gave away air conditioners into people's homes in the 70s in this state. They electrified a rail track up to Rockhampton just to use the excess electricity. And now we just don't even have a coal-fired power station always reliably working. So this bloke is driving us all to the brink of economic ruin. And so, fix up fuel standards. But I think he should just simply go because he's destroying us all. Chris Bowen, but our Anthony Albanese's allowing it all to happen. So it is the Prime Minister's fault, Peter, no matter which way you look at it.
I tell you, if I was back in the Coalition Tactics Committee working on questions for question time, I'd be wanting to have plenty of questions to Chris Bowen because every single time he's up, he's a gift to the other side. I think he just is toxic to the Labor brand, and he just reminds people of all these broken promises, particularly on their power bills. What about this one, Keith? You pointed this one out to me, and I couldn't believe then to watch Richard Marles get up to his feet today in question time and lead with his chin, crowing about the fact the government is going to spend $4.6 billion of our Australian taxpayer money building nuclear reactors at Rolls-Royce in the UK and then bring them here and put them inside our submarines. They say they hate nuclear power. It's way too expensive to have nuclear power. But they're actually basically proving your point, isn't it?
Yep. Oh, Peter, the most extraordinary part of this was that the question before that one was Chris Bowen banging on about how they won't have nuclear power in Australia, followed by Richard
Yes, I noted that.
saying how the taxpayer will invest nearly $5 billion, and that money will go into logistics, supply chains, training, developing, building reactors, training lots and lots of people, including apprentices. But guess where? All in the United Kingdom. And that's great. We need this. This is part of the Virginia-class subs and the nuclear program. Then they'll take that reactor and they'll take it from the UK and they'll take it to Adelaide. And in Adelaide, in the capital city, they'll put it in a submarine. That submarine, when operational, will then travel around the world. It will go to ports around Australia and it'll have an Australian paid-for nuclear reactor in it, but not one that you can use for electricity on land. And that was certainly the quotes we were putting across to Mr Bowen. Does that reactor generate electricity on a submarine? And it absolutely does.
Yeah, and how can you be against nuclear power on land but for nuclear power on sea? And I think this is where they're really going to come unstuck between now and the election.
Yeah,
I hope they come unstuck. Gary, put your Queensland hat on there for a moment, because around the country, we are looking at what's happening up there with the Brisbane Olympics bid. I can't follow it anymore. It's got more contortions than Nadia Comaneci. There, I'm showing my age there. But what the hell is going on? Are we going to have the Olympics in Brisbane?
And happy birthday for the other day, Peter. Let me rescue you from the age point. When I was 17, 47 years ago, I went to the opening of this QE2 stadium, as it was called. Her Majesty drove around in an open vehicle and waved to all of us school kids. I was from McGregor High School, my old school, just down the road from this stadium. The building is 46 years old, 48 years old, actually, because it's 47 years ago it was open. And this is apparently the brain snap of the current Premier. And everybody's saying, oh, we'll just reuse the facility we used to have. They wanted to do a cut price Olympics. But hang on, the whole idea of the Olympics, the reason why the various mayors of South East Queensland wanted it, it was about building the infrastructure that South East Queensland needed, not for 2032, but for 2045. But no one has put together a generational plan for the infrastructure we need. And a lot of Queenslanders are just throwing their hands up in the air and saying they can tell you the colour of the curtains in the VIP room, but don't know how they're going to build a stadium. And every time you turn around, there's another delay. We have wasted over 1,000 days. And then on top of that, 1,000 days since it was announced, the CFMEU want their share. There's a $6 billion CFMEU tax on construction right across Queensland. Everybody's price of building things has gone up because of them. Stephen Miles won't say anything about it. David Crisafulli has now been set up for a problem should he win the election, because he's going to have to take the unions on. We have to fix up the building unions in Australia, and particularly here in Queensland, or nothing is going to get built. And it's a big issue that David Crisafulli is going to have to get his head around, because Miles is just presenting it to him. And talk about a hospital pass, my stars, what a mess we've got ahead of us. I don't know whether the games will actually ever go ahead. That's how bad it is.
Well, that's the cancer. That CFMEU cancer out of Victoria is obviously travelling north. It's the reverse cane toad, but you can have it as well as us. It's terrible. It needs to be tackled. Talk to me about these Palestinian rallies, Keith. More of them pro-Palestine rallies, of course, in Sydney over the weekend. We saw the Greens Deputy Leader, Maureen Faruqi, out there. This is all about a demonstration regarding the unloading of an Israeli cargo ship in Port Botany. 19 arrested and charged. Finally, we're seeing some arrests. We saw a whole lot of people try and disrupt Douglas Murray's event at the Enmore Theatre. Victoria Police have been talking about introducing protest permits in Victoria. I'm a bit uneasy about this, because I think there has to be a right to free speech. But there's not enough free speech on the right. There's a hell of a lot of free speech, but violence on the left. How do we handle this?
And I think you make the right point there, Peter. The challenge with this is they want the conflict. One of the reasons they don't want permits is they want to ensure that they can get conflicting groups at the same location at the same time, because that gets them the grab on the news. They want to hold things up. They want to disrupt. They want to cause chaos, because that gets the grab on the news. They don't care about the individual that's trying to get to a hospital or trying to get to work, or all of those actual urgent things that people have to do. I'm with you. I support their right to protest, but not their right to disrupt everyday Australians who are just going about their business. And it is starting to turn, Peter. I don't like seeing what's happening. The fact that 19 people were arrested, clearly they were doing the wrong thing. And there does need to be a crackdown. Can you imagine this caper in Queensland under Joe Bjelke-Petersen?
Oh, God, Lord, no way. I mean, you are right to point out, you can have a protest now in favour of women's rights. You know, in the 60s, you used to march in the street and burn your bra. That sort of protest now, pro-women protest, brings out all the trans activists as if somehow defending the rights of women is attacking the rights of trans people. Right, gents, we'll leave it there. Catch up with you both next week. Well, they're not women, you're right there. I'll leave it there. Enough of that. After the break, we'll go straight to London and get the latest on Princess Catherine. Welcome back. Well, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, has finally put months of speculation to rest over the weekend, revealing that the abdominal surgery she had earlier this year has later discovered cancer. Her video announcement came after conspiracy theories circulated about the princess's health, her whereabouts, even her marriage, kicked off by that photoshopped image released for Mother's Day. For the latest on this, let's try now and bring in our Talk TV editor, Sarah Hewson. Have we got you now, Sarah Hewson? No, we haven't. We're just going to try and pick her up there. I don't know if you watched the imagery over the weekend. It was a very beautiful and very honest speech from the princess. We're told that she wrote it herself, that it was her decision to do the announcement. And of course, it came forward, that announcement, you could see her there at home on the park bench. It came forward after she had safely taken the children off to the Easter holiday so that they were not subjected to speculation when they're at school. I think we've got Sarah now. We'll bring her in. Sarah, what's been the reaction of the public and the press in Britain? Because it's certainly been the lead story in Australia for 48 hours.
Front page of every single newspaper in the UK, that image of the Princess of Wales sitting on the bench there in Windsor in her darkest hour was on every single one of them. I think the hope was that she was getting better, that she would be back to public duties, and it was a huge shock to hear that actually following that surgery she had received a cancer diagnosis.
One of the things that's fascinated me in the management of this issue, I think the media, broadly speaking, has been very good to the princess, and she, haven't pushed about details for her original surgery. Lots of well wishes since this announcement over the weekend. But why does the royal family, or what is the palace advisors, seem to have reacted? I would say almost overreacted to the trolls. I mean, you and I are both in the media. If I read what all the haters out there might say about me, I'd go mad. So why have they taken so much of these conspiracy theories to heart and made the decision to come out publicly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Haters are going to hate, and it doesn't matter what they say at Kensington Palace. That is still going to go on. The problem was these conspiracy theories started to break their way into the mainstream. I'm told that this statement was not a direct reaction to those rumours and the scurrilous accusations and speculation that have been going on online. It was that the Princess of Wales wanted to be upfront with the public. She knew that after that photo editing misstep, there was a potential issue of trust. She wanted to put it out there. She wanted to tell people what was going on, and she wanted to do it in her own time. And of course, that, as you were saying, Peter, was all about telling the children first and then the public. And I think she was also buoyed by the reaction that the King had to revealing his diagnosis. So they say it wasn't about the trolls. And to a large part, this should put an end to the speculation, although looking on social media, it's still going to go on, and there's nothing they can do about that.
Yeah, I think it is a social media whirlwind. I think a lot of it's driven out of the United States. It's certainly not what you're hearing in vox pops on the streets here and in Britain. Yeah. And I think, as I said, the media has been quite respectful. I don't need to know any more details than we know now. I think people just wish her well. Any sense of when she'll be back resuming public duties?
I agree with you, Peter. I think what she did in that statement was very clear, which was saying, look, don't ask me anymore, and don't ask me when I'm coming back. I will be back. I want to be back, but I'll be back when I'm ready. And she said she needs that time to spend with her family. She needs the time to heal. She loves her work, but she'll be back when she's made a full recovery. And so I think now any talk of putting a date on it is premature. We're it's going to be in the medical team's hands and up to the Princess of Wales herself. She's going to carry on with her routine, though. We might see her out and about, that visit to the farm shop, nothing out of the ordinary for her. But I think what was clear in that statement, please let me do that. Please let me carry on and let me do it in privacy with my family around me.
I've got to go now, Sarah, but just quickly, I mean, there's a lot on the Prince of Wales' shoulders too.
Wow, what a burden he is carrying. His father's diagnosis and his wife's diagnosis, trying to keep the family going and also maintain his constitutional duties. It is an awful lot for one man to take.
Well, it is too, Sarah. Thank you for your time. That's it for me. Tomorrow night, back here at 6. Here's Andrew.